Just wanted to make sure.
Good evening, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives. Tonight, very, very important discussion we're going to have tonight. As many of you all know, being somebody who is on the left and somebody who sympathizes with Marxists, who considers himself, a socialist on the spectrum, and who deals with people who have bought into Karl Marx from start to finish, maybe only read volume 1, if you will, but are actually really, really missing some very, very key underlying points about the way the system operates beneath it. We're going to be discussing how modern monetary theory and Marx work together, dispelling once and for all any of the myths or legends that some of our Marxist socialist friends have told themselves to block them from listening to MMT, which is just unfathomable. It's crazy to me. We're providing the keys to the kingdom, if you will. We're providing a method and a way to get from A to Z. We're hoping people will pay attention and listen up. This is a very important subject. Without further ado, let me bring on my guest, Nathan Tankus. Welcome to Real Progressive, sir. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So we are always happy to have you, man. And, as I talk to you offline, I'm obviously the people that I deal with, many of them are Marxists and they have no idea when I say no understanding, I mean no understanding of how our monetary system works. And so they make assumptions. They make assumptions that it's just got to be capitalism. They don't understand money creation at a state level. They assume that the state and the corporations are one and the same, and that it's labor versus the world. And quite frankly, I just don't think they understand what a modern money system looks like in a sovereign state currency as we have today.
Yeah. I mean, you encounter this all the time. And of course, as being a New York leftist, you can imagine that however much you get it, I get it 20 times more than you. I mean, I go to events at, places like Verso, which is a famous, left publisher. I go to events of dissent. So, I in Jacobin events. So, I'm regularly encountering people, I should say some people who are sympathetic and knowledgeable and and agree. And frankly, some people who are more knowledgeable about Marx and who Marx was citing than your average person on the street. But you will, of course, encounter the person who is very dismissive of MMT, of chartalism. They think because of, their Marxist background. And of course, the Marxist tradition is a huge, very heterogeneous tradition. We went into all sorts of different directions over, now 150 years now, if not more. And so, of course, you're going to get things that are completely inconsistent with MMT, but you're also going to get things that aren't. And, there is a strand of tradition going straight from Marx that definitely influenced post-Keynesians and then MMTers down the line. And so we'll be getting into a little bit of that tonight.
Okay, so, in talking with, I want to tee up a couple subjects that I'm sure you'll touch on as we go through this. But I want to tee up, Ajamo spoke specifically to me about labor theory of value. He spoke specifically about capital flight. And they didn't quite understand the fact that, hey, if the state's able to create money out of thin air, how does that impact, labor theory of value? And how does that impact labor and so forth? And I want to make sure that we address these very important things. In July, I believe it's July 13th, I'll be in Newark speaking at the Green Party National Convention. Very excited about that. But obviously, I'm going to be surrounded by Marxists that probably either haven't taken the time to bother to learn how our monetary system works, or have been, quite frankly, swept away in the Alex Jones AMI style version of debt and deficits, etc. So all your help tonight is going to help me be more prepared to speak to them so that I can help improve the Green Party and help move them into a modern money understanding so that they can actually be effective in their policies.
Yeah. So first things to say about, whatever your position about the labor theory of value, it's important to be clear what it's talking about. What the labor theory of value is about is that first, before you even get to labor specifically, that value, the things that we need in society, the biophysical resources, the produced goods and services, that all that emerge in production. And that's an important distinction because, there are a lot of other theories of value where value emerges in places other than production, and that things that we need are created. For example, in mainstream economics, value is created by people's subjectivity. People subjectively saying, I value that a lot. Their utility is what ascribes value to things. And so, first of all, it's important to note that, MMT is focusing on how the monetary system works, but it's not denying that, that a surplus, goods and services that we can use for other purposes besides our basic subsistence are produced. And, no one is saying that, money is alchemy, that you can print a bunch of money or, create a bunch of bank deposits and that, can, create goods and services out of nothing. No, those goods and services still have to be produced. So there's nothing about, MMT or post-Keynesianism that denies that essential idea. But it is true that in order for, in Marxian terms, in order for goods and services to have their value realized, in order for them to be sold, they need to be purchased. In order to be purchased, the people who are doing the purchasing need to be able to buy it. And that goes back to Keynes, effective demand, post-Keynesianism, Chartism. And, there are plenty of people, not only in the Marxist tradition, but also in the post-Keynesian tradition that trace the idea of effective demand, the idea that it's demand that determines, how much goods and services that are out there, given that there's the ability to produce them, and that, supply doesn't create its own demand. Trace that idea to Marx. And Marx has really, famous, very virulent criticisms of Say and of this economist, John Baptiste Say, and Say's law. And, some of the strongest criticisms of Say's law, which Keynes followed along and post-Keynesians followed along and Chartists followed along, and MMT, can be traced to Marx's original writings. Now, that isn't to say that everything that Marx ever wrote is consistent with what we would say now. Marx, if you look at the collected works of Marx and Engels, it goes volumes and volumes and volumes, and there's even more stuff, especially later stuff on finance, which apparently still hasn't been published in English. And it's just started to get published in German the last decade or so. But, there's certainly a tradition that follows there. Someone like Michał Kalecki, who was, a famous Polish economist, went to Cambridge in the 30s and was seen as sort of a forerunner or developing the same ideas at the same times as Keynes. Joan Robinson famously preferred his version, the way he stated the theory of effective demand over Keynes's version. Traced his, vision of accounting, his famous profits equation, which is sort of a forerunner to stock flow consistent economics, which is, and stock flow consistency, which is, a big, huge thing in Chartism. Traced that back all the way to volume 2, and volume 2 of Capital, which is, widely seen, especially among post-Keynesians and Marxists and all these other non-mainstream economists, as sort of the origin of stock flow consistent modeling, or at least a large precursor to it.
Very, very cool. And so when you say stock flow, can you explain to our viewers what, in fact, that means? Stock flow consistent models. Folks, take note. This is important.
Sure. So the basic idea with stock flow consistent models is the idea that if you want to understand something, that how something is working in an entire economy, is you need to trace everything that's going on in it. You need to be able to say that the flows, to define flow real quick, flow is just, the amount of something that is either produced or purchased over a period of time. An analogy that people like is the bathtub metaphor, where a flow is the rate at which water is coming out of the faucet and going out the drain, and a stock is the level of the water of the bathtub at a point in time. And so the idea is that you have to make sure that flows are always going somewhere. They're always increasing a stock, and flows are always leaving somewhere, decreasing a stock. And that you need to understand that, the economy, especially, a monetary system, is a closed system in the sense that everything has to go from somewhere, come from somewhere, and go somewhere else. And so the idea is you need to be able to trace where everything's going, and it's only when you're able to kind of have that, full established view that you're able to really see what's going on in an economy. If you just try to, make sure you can see that follow the flows, but you're not following the stocks, things, private debt accumulating relative to GDP, or how much public debt is out there relative to GDP, that you're not really knowing what's going on in the economy. So a big example would be someone like Steve Keen's work. So if you just follow the flows, you might know how much private debt is being created each year, but you won't, if you don't follow the stocks, you won't know that, in 2006, there's, 150% of private debt relative to GDP, which is huge, and that this might cause a crisis. So stock flow consistent modeling is crucial in order to be able to, see something build up and see a crisis happening. And, it's widely seen that you can trace that to Marx's Volume 2.
So let me ask you, Nate, given that most Marxists tend to not, and this is just my experience in terms of dealing with my people here, they tend to not want to hear anything about the monetary system. They tend to bypass the creation of money, and they jump straight to things like fairness and workplace ownership and on and on and on. And there's like very clear balkanization or demarcation or whatever you want to say between money creation, which is agnostic, it's not political, it doesn't really have an ideology behind it. It's kind of like a science, it's a system. It shows how things go from A, B, C. On the other side, though, without understanding the underlying monetary system, I have frequently called Marxists, they're like religious priests in their own right. They're talking about beliefs as opposed to talking about the underlying, what you're talking about with the stock flow consistent modeling and so forth, which is the underlying factors that go within. This chasm creates an unnecessary speed bump in people understanding modern monetary theory. They're not in conflict with one another. Although I will say that many of the practitioners, modern practitioners of Marxist doctrine are, in my opinion, religious people. They're not talking about facts, they're talking about faith and ideology, like, quite frankly, our friend Richard Wolff, who doesn't really have the basics of the underlying mechanism down, or if he does, he doesn't speak to it. But he has all the mythology or the mysticism or the religious beliefs and the I should and I believes and stuff like that. Nothing wrong with any of that. But the problem is the underlying mechanism that enables it, there is conflict, and there need not be. Help me grease the skids there, Nathan. How do we get past that?
I would say that that's certainly true, although I would say it's not universal among Marxists. There's a lot of Marxists who have, major dialogue with with post-Keynesians and with charterlists. There's people like Riccardo Bellafiore from Italy, who is, I would say, is a consistent economist, someone who gets his work reviewed by Ray and cites people like Ray and all this, and of course Ray himself has Randall Ray, of course, and people like Matthew Forsetter has written about Marx and talked about the relationship with their views and Marx. I would say that there is something to what you're saying, though. I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but there's this famous essay by Joan Robinson called "Open Letter from a Keynesian to a Marxist," and it's famous for this exact point that, I read Marx and I find it fascinating, and there's so much, in here that's important, but I talk to you guys, and you guys are just telling me how he's a genius without really, telling me anything else. Her famous line about this is, what I mean is that I have Marx in my bones and you have him in your mouth. And that's a key point, that the idea that, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in Marx, but you have to work it out for yourself. You're just does this make sense to me? And there is an instinct among a certain strand of Marxists who just know it's the truth, and they just have to figure out how it's the truth, rather than, picking and choosing and seeing, does this make sense to me? Does this not make sense? And that doesn't mean you shouldn't. I mean, Marx is, a foundational person in the history of economic thought. So if you can see if there's a way your views are consistent with him, that's important to do. And, if there's some, trace back there, but ultimately, if you confront something that you think is just completely wrong, you have to push against it and say, no, I think differently about this. I also say that, a lot of the most religious people about Marx, in my experience, are people who haven't read a ton of Marx. I've talked to people who I won't name, who consider themselves convinced Marxists, and you try to talk to them about Volume 1 or Volume 2, even Volume 1, but something more likely Volumes 2 or 3, or The Theories of Surplus Value, which is, this manuscript from the 1861 to 1863 that's really interesting. And, their eyes glaze over, and they're like, as Joan Robinson says, they say Marx is a genius. And you just go well, all right. The original quote is, how could he make a mistake? Don't you know that he was a genius? And he gives me a little lecture on Marx's genius. And I think to myself, this man may be a Marxist, but he doesn't know much about geniuses. Your plodding mind goes step by step and has time to be careful and avoid slips. Your genius wears 7-league boots and goes striding along, leaving a paper chase of little mistakes behind him. And who cares? I say, never mind about Marx's genius. Is this a stock, or is it the flow? Then the Marxist gets rather huffy and changes the subject. And I think to myself, this man may be a Marxist, but he doesn't know much about riding a bicycle, which basically just means he doesn't know much about doing it himself and figuring it out for yourself.
So what do you think is the attraction, if you will, to people that place is it an identity that people cling to that prevent them from seeing beyond it? Is it kind of I'll tell you the reason why I'm saying this. As somebody who has some religious background and talking to people, everything you say to a fundamentalist Christian, for example, everything has to pass through the lens of what they believe the Bible says to them. So it doesn't matter anything else. You could show them dinosaur bones, or you could show them whatever. If in their mind the Bible said this, then they don't even believe in dinosaurs. If you tell them the earth is round and they read it one of their catechisms that it's not round, it's flat, then it's absolute bunk. That's what I find with many, many people that claim to be Marxists. They don't actually investigate. They don't actually dig in. They've got a belief. That's the belief. That's where it stops. That's where it ends. How do we break through that wall so that they can see the fulfillment of the belief they profess, but actually in its fullness? What is your suggestion there?
certainly an option. One thing is, frankly, there is an internet post-rev, but most more on the side of believing, with Marx and
Hey Nathan, we're
those.
losing your
Yeah.
voice. We're losing your voice. Like it's
Okay.
cutting in and out. I'm not sure what happened, but
Yeah.
nope, you're kind of cutting in and out, brother.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what that is. Crap.
That's okay. I hear you now fine. See if it's.
You hear me now fine?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Sorry to cut your vibe there.
No worries. Yeah, so I would say that, that the caution there is that a lot of the more people who are believing rather than thinking about Marx are, the kind of people who are more vigorously promoting their thought on the internet and attacking other things. I've encountered certainly plenty of people who consider themselves some type of Marxists who are very open in having these kinds of discussions. And of course, people who are scholars, people who are academics in this area. There's certainly people who have, committed a lot of time to this and want to see a consistency in Marx, but they're also open in talking about it and in tracing the intellectual roots. There are people like I mentioned, like Bellafiore, people like Fred Mosley. There is, a Marxian tradition there that, and of course, there are plenty of people who were influenced by Marx who went on to develop post-Keynesian. Minsky, of course, is, a famous example who sort of didn't cite Marx all that much because, he opened up his career during the McCarthy era, but, certainly was very influenced by Marx. And there's stories from his son about, when he asked, what to read on economics, being handed Capital before anything else. But that, so there is, a heterogeneous thing. I think the thing to emphasize is that there's nothing inherently in understanding how the monetary system works that goes against seeing that goes against seeing surplus value as being sourced in production. There's nothing in MMT that says that owning the means of production is a productive act in and itself. I mean, you'll have certain people argue, people like Steve Keen most famously, that you can get a surplus, that the source of the surplus isn't just workers, but is also a means of production. But, as, first said by John Robinson and then, later by Keen and other people, just because, means of production might be productive of surplus doesn't mean owning them is inherently productive. And so there's no inconsistency with seeing, ownership as giving the ability of capitalists to, extract a surplus out of our biophysical resources and out of human beings, while also saying that, that the owning of the things isn't necessarily productive. There's nothing about MMT that says the government is good or gonna necessarily act in your interest. There's nothing even in MMT that says that the state isn't often the kind of managers of the ruling committee of the bourgeois of the ruling class of the bourgeoisie. There's nothing inherently inconsistent with even non-Marxist seeing that how money driven American politics is and seeing how you can use money to have an outsized voice in American politics and even potentially control political parties. There's nothing in MMT that says that that stuff isn't true. On the other hand, MMT might make it easier to make the case of having public finance for elections, which would at least have some effect in terms of making the country more democratic. That there is no inherent the fundamentals of of what people get out of Marx, about seeing the class antagonism, essentially dictatorship by capitalists, and a overwhelmingly dominant control of our lives, and being able to tell us what to do from 9 to 5 or even longer. There is no inherent conflict. You won't be able to swear by every single word in Capital or earlier writings that you could before, but maybe it wasn't a great idea to swear by every word in the first place.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I guess my concern, Nathan, is that as we approach trying to, I'm going to use a term, unfuck our world, unfuck our country, okay, unscrew it up, right? Let's just say hypothetically, we all had this goal of going to a totally Marxist compliant society tomorrow. It wouldn't happen. It couldn't happen that quickly. There's going to have to be some sort of transition regardless. And so what we end up doing, and I'm watching this happen in our movement over and over again, the minute we move the football ever so slightly, people are jumping far down the road. Oh, we want a resource-based economy. Oh, we want this. Oh, we want that. And the reality is that no matter what, there's going to happen in phases. There's no way to just rip and replace unless there's some sort of a cataclysmic event. At least in my mind, I can't see it. What are some expectations that people that are born again Marxists, that are trying to learn modern monetary theory and are politically active? What are some things they can expect, or some wins that they can expect in a meaningful sense along this trajectory to their final destination, if there is ever such a thing? What would you say is that some things that they can expect along the way? How does MMT facilitate that?
Well, I think first it's important to say that whatever else you want to say about Marx was a theorist of capitalism. He wanted to understand how capitalism worked. Of course he wrote the Communist Manifesto, but that's not really laying out a roadmap. And that, of course, is also an early piece of writing, well before he kind of really fully to the extent he ever did, fully develop his theoretical apparatus. So it's important to understand, whatever your views on socialism or communism or any of that stuff, that doesn't really touch like 95%, even more, of what Marx wrote. Marx fundamentally was just always trying to figure out how capitalism worked. And so that, nothing about Marx stands or falls about your view about the next society, in terms of being, a radical, in terms of, having, maybe some of the same, broader political convictions of Marx or other people. I would say that, plenty of Marxists I know, Jacobin is probably the most famous, stand bearer of this right now, don't really, have any fundamental belief that, we're going to have, some sudden revolutionary struggle and, create the new world, instantly. I mean, nearly every Marxist, radical, leftist I know, doesn't have that sort of vision right now. Maybe that is a lack of vision, but, universally it seems to think that there is some non-reformist reform. There's a whole debate among in the Marxist tradition about reform versus revolution, and one of the ideas that has sort of been developed, to try to deal with this historical argument and adjust it to present conditions is that we have ways that we reform society, but they don't just stagnate us into not getting past capitalism. They're things that help propel us and develop society in a direction that we might eventually move beyond capitalism. And I know plenty of leftists who see the job guarantee as a non-reformist reform, as something that reforms, that genuinely makes life under capitalism better, but also that creates the that creates the seeds of developing alternative ways of living your life, alternative ways of producing. Of course, job guarantee sets up sort of laboratory for developing other sorts of other sorts of ways of producing that aren't attempting to get at a surplus of money. And in Why Minsky Matters, Ray, in his biography of Minsky, or his intellectual biography of Minsky, explicitly suggests that a job guarantee could be used to fund cooperatives, that a job guarantee could essentially pay the wages of cooperatives, and that could be one way in which the job guarantee could contribute to being a laboratory. So I would definitely, that there is a long tradition of, and of course, there's also a long radical tradition of supporting a job guarantee. There's, the review of black political economy was, especially in the early 70s, a strong supporter of a job guarantee. Of course, Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King were supporters of the job guarantee. And there's a whole civil rights tradition around, and of course the original civil rights, the original March on Washington in 1963 was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. So there certainly is a left tradition about our main policy program, which is the job guarantee, and seeing it as a non-reformist reform. And so, I don't think there's anything particularly troubling for that for a lot of leftists I know. Of course, even, Jacobin and Bhaskar Sankara, those people are explicit, at least at times, about supporting a job guarantee. So I don't think that any of that is particularly troublesome from a left point of view. Now, of course, there are people who disagree, who don't think there's any such thing as a non-reformist reform. And for those people, they might not find MMT particularly useful in terms of fighting for something practical that they're interested in. But you're going to have to understand how money works if you're going to build a post-capitalism system, and also to debate whether you want to get rid of money. And there's a long debate about that in revolutionary times that I think would have certainly benefited from MMT ideas. But for most leftists I know, I don't actually think that this is much of a conflict.
So Scott Ferguson raises the question, what about dispelling specific, allegedly Marxist arguments against MMT that prevent us from acting on what MMT, and I missed that last part there, make possible? There you go.
Yeah. So I'd say the one big thing is the one thing you mentioned earlier, which is what I would sort of call a quasi-Marxist argument, which is capital flight. What about capital flight? This is a really popular one. I mean, you can almost, it's a running joke among friends of mine that, what about capital flight is the answer to almost every question that, a Marxist asks. If someone asks them, what do they want for breakfast? They go, what about capital flight? I think, yeah, it can get ridiculous at times. What I would say on the capital flight point is, first of all, what do you mean? I find often puts Marxists on their heels, that, Marx is all about, not buying into essentially mystifying BS and buying into things that mystify what's actually going on. And for all the discussion among Marx, where he's trying to distinguish between, different forms of capital, whether it's capital in an inventory form that he calls commodity capital, whether it's means of production, whether it's variable capital and constant capital, which is just sums of money that are going to be used to pay wages, or sums of money that is going to be able to use to buy intermediate inputs, things that you use in the production process that aren't labor, and buy machines. That when people say capital flight, they're never clear on what they mean. Do they mean that, literally capitalists are going to be physically picking up machines and, transporting them out of the country? Now, of course, that happens sometimes. Famously during NAFTA, there was apparently, machines that were packed up in factories and driven across the border into Mexico and set up in new factories. But that's very rare. Most things are, for all of this view of, the sort of what I would say a mystifying view of this, capital flowing around the globe, jumping from here and there at a moment's instant, the physical stuff stays there. And, no matter what, even if you have, countries where you can allegedly say that there was capital flight, most of the physical stuff is still there. So you have to be clear about what you mean. Now, of course, money can in some sense, or ownership claims can go across borders, but then suddenly we're in a conversation about the payment system and about the monetary system, something that these supposed Marxists are not supposed to be, don't want to talk about, and is irrelevant. Well, let's take, if you want to get if you own a bunch of stock, 10% of a stock in a U.S. company, and you want to, transfer that into a form that's usable to you in Beijing, well, there's no way for that capital to flow, for you to have that happen, for that supposed capital flight to happen, unless you sell your shares. And for you to sell your shares, someone with dollars has to buy shares. So so you still have to have a buyer on the other side, and then it's still not good enough because you still have these U.S. dollars in a bank account in the U.S. Well, you're going to have to sell them for some yuan, and someone is going to have to buy those dollars from you. So it looks from my point of view that no dollar has left the U.S. The physical machines in that company haven't left the U.S. The stock ownership is still, all those stocks still exist. All that's happened is the owners have changed. Okay, so capital flight has happened. But what does that matter? Now, the big thing where this could be important is it can affect the exchange rate. So if, you have a whole bunch of people who sell their stocks or sell their bonds or sell their government bonds and then sell them for yuan or for euros, well, then you can depreciate the exchange rate. And, the exchange rate can go down even large amounts, 10, 20%, and that might be painful for people. The prices of imports go up. Of course, export industries, quote unquote, benefit. And, it might or might not change our trade balance, but the fundamentals are still there. All the means of production are still there. All the land, the buildings, all that stuff is still there. It might have a negative effect, but that does, just because the exchange rate has depreciated 10% doesn't mean that you can't, still hire people with a job guarantee or still buy things that are sold in dollars. There's nothing, inherently has changed. Now, there are southern countries where this can be a self-fulfilling process that can be devastating. A big example would be the East Asian crisis in 1997. But what was the big thing there? The big thing was that, you had people in South Korea and in Malaysia who owed dollars. They owed foreign currencies, and the depreciation of the exchange rate increased the burden of their debts, and that's what crushed them. And MMT has never denied that if you have a whole bunch of foreign-denominated debt, then your exchange rate can go down, and that can really, harm your financial system, harm your economy, harm domestic residents. No MMTer has ever denied that, and in fact has explicitly commented on it. And part of the whole point is warning about the dangers of foreign-denominated debt. But the important thing is to be clear about what the process is we're talking about and what the causal mechanisms are. And a lot of times when you talk to people who are invoking this capital flight argument, they are doing that without really regard to what's going on. What is the underlying biophysical relationships? What are the underlying ownership relationships? What's going on with the payment system? And once you do that, you see that, things look very differently when you're in a country like the U.S. that doesn't have a bunch of foreign denominated debt and has its own currency than those other countries in other situations. And a lot of people, invoke the Greek example or other examples from the Eurozone, which of course, MMTers were very early into talking about the potential dangers in the Eurozone. Professor Kelton's book in 2003, I think, is called "The State, the Market, and the Euro," about how potentially dangerous the euro situation was and how unsustainable the euro was. This is an extremely early call about the possibility of a crisis in the eurozone. And so I think that gets into the other side of this, is that a lot of people say, well, this isn't relevant. This only applies to the United States or a few countries. Well, part of the point is that, we're highlighting exactly what the dangers of not being a monetary sovereign is, and what you need to do to, get on the right side of that.
So, I wanted to bring up something that's important here. We get into a lot of fights here, quite frankly, about the idea of eating the rich and the idea of taxing the rich and taxing wealth and going after this, that, and the other. And there's an assumption. Now, mind you, I know Marx started getting into some stuff for our conversation earlier tonight, where you had said that he started getting into some understanding about how state money worked. I'll let you touch on that. But the idea here is that most people in our modern society are not 6 feet under from 100 years ago. They're here and now, and they've only read selected pieces. So when you try and explain to them that taxation is deleted, that the federal taxes come in, they purge reserves, whatever you want to say, however technical you want to get about it, bottom line is they aren't reused. They're gone. They don't do anything. So the real emphasis, in my opinion, needs to be on rectifying the lack of income for the 99%. And when I try to explain that since taxes don't fund anything, they don't actually pay for stuff. They drive currency, but they don't actually pay for things. They don't actually get redistributed at the federal level. When I try and say that to them, they still harken back, oh, he's saying that we shouldn't tax the rich or whatever. And the point is that in my understanding of the thrust of modern monetary theory, the key to getting us to both income inequality, solving that problem and solving many others is indeed through full employment, through the federal job guarantee, which takes the most vulnerable of us out of the business of borrowing to pay for bread, out of the business of borrowing to pay for electric, out of the business of borrowing to pay for basic necessities, and allows them instead to survive without going to the 22% interest rate private debt that is driven as a scarcity of dollars by Friedman-esque kind of economic policies. It seems to me that these Marxists don't understand that since taxes are deleted, that in order to help the bottom out, the primary help is giving them access to options and financial instruments, if you will, whereas the top, we can tax the hell out of them after we solve the suffering. I don't quite understand why they don't get that, and that's a key issue to me in them not understanding the money system. They only understand this one idea, and they've eradicated any kind of logic beyond that. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Well, I think one of the parts that I think is really ironic about that is, well, the household wealth of the rich as households, as Marx would say, capitalist as man about town, that part, element isn't where the control is. That isn't where they, in Marx's language, control the means of production. So you can tax the crap out of the rich and we might even think that's a positive thing, but that doesn't do anything to affect their control of the means of production. They might, them as, men about town might make less political contributions. They might, consume less luxury goods, less capitalist consumption. And we might think that that's a good thing, and you redistributing resources away from, being burnt on, making sure, all the yachts look nice and they can go around on yachts. That the control isn't really on the household side. So part of the importance, part of something that, Charles would agree with is that, taxing the rich doesn't actually do anything to get rid of their control. They're still setting prices. They're still doing all of this stuff. So I think that's one important point to make. The other important point to make that I think where Marxists miss is that, and some, that might be perpetuated by, the way some MMTers approach that dialogue, is that separating taxing the rich from spending on social programs, the point isn't to defend the rich and to, making sure that they have all the good things in life. The point is a political point that, when you connect taxing the rich to doing these social programs, you limit your social programs to whatever you can tax out of them and whatever, overseas accounts you can find. But B, you're giving them a false control. So, for example, a professor of mine, Josh Mason, who's, a Marxist, but also, I wouldn't say an MMTer, but pretty sympathetic to MMTer, rightly points out that when you say that, capitalists fund the government either as people paying taxes or buying bonds, you're saying that they have control over the government in their capacity of, being money owners. And that's not true. Now, they might have political control through, campaign contributions, but that's something that politicians are actively conceding. They're choosing to, cede to their wishes. They can make a different decision in an office, even as difficult as that is. But you're exaggerating that their importance to this system. You're also making it more difficult to move beyond capitalism, because in certain limited way you're implying that we need them. If you want to say that the means of production are the true source of wealth, well, part of that is saying that capitalist money, that the money that capitalists own is just, some claim, and we don't need it in order to, do what we want with the means of production. And I think that that's an essential point too. That you're, even that there's, when you talk to a lot of these people and they talk about taxing the rich, they present it as this radical thing. But really what you're saying is capitalists are too important, and that, and that we can't get rid of them, in some, deep sense. But B, you're also saying that, that the way we can reorganize our society is limited. Part of, looking past the veil of money and looking at what's really going on, and, what's really going on with the means of production and production is, seeing the monetary system for what it is, and, seeing the importance of taxation and tax receivability behind it. And so, that's, there's no, MMT, argument explicitly against taxing the rich. The point is to make our policy program of taxing the rich, separate from our policy program of, say, full employment or, more public services, and that it's crucial for these to be separate things. And yeah.
I want you to correct me on something. If I'm wrong, if I'm right, I want you to back me up. Okay.
Okay.
My thoughts are, and Ellis Winningham and I have really, really just locked into this. And if I'm wrong, I need to change it ASAP. Okay.
Okay.
But since the act of taxing and the act of spending are different functions and serve very different needs, why in the world, when you're trying to get to the other side from A to Z, why would you put unnecessary boundaries in there to save lives? Single-payer healthcare immediately saves lives. Green
Absolutely.
energy today immediately starts saving the planet, which saves lives and stops wars, ironically. And then you get into college, free college for all, or eliminating student debt. My God, private debt in and of itself in this country is the financial situations that most people find themselves in as non-monetarily sovereign entities causes people to commit suicide, leaves them destitute, leaves them desperate, etc. So in my mind, the idea of putting a barrier of, well, we've got to find tax dollars before we can help anybody is quite frankly murder by proxy. It is an ideological, religious argument in the face of a modern money system that is inexcusable in my book. And those people that advocate for it have said it's more important for me to get my feels taken care of with soaking and eating the rich than saving lives, which to me, once again, makes them literally a murderer by proxy. I'm sure I'm harsher than you are on that, but that's
you're harsher than me, but I'm definitely with you in the general point that, part of the problem is you make it that much harder. And, it's hard enough to get single payer through, to get these things through. But tying it to, well, we need to tax X, Y, and Z, and we want it to, specifically come from the rich it hobbles the program even more, and it makes your arguments more convoluted. Like, oh, I want single payer, but only if we can, projected, have it, quote unquote, fully funded, yada, yada, yada. It just weakens the argument where you just say single payer and don't talk about any of that crap. Just argue for single payer. And I think that the argument for taxing the rich is straightforwardly an argument about, reducing their consumption, which, we see is not a very useful use of our collective resources, and to reduce their political power. But, if we have the political power, if we have our one shot, where we can have a movement pushing something, well, we shouldn't be spending that shot on taxing the rich. That shot should absolutely be about single payer and climate change. I mean, these are the essential things that if we get to the point where we have to make some big argument, that has to be the thing. If the argument we win is taxing the rich, well, I mean, the most basic point is if the argument we win is taxing the rich and no one's lives get better, well, then you lose the election, and then they come in. What do? They said, look how terrible things are, and the riches and the taxes on the rich are so high, we got to cut them. I mean, not only is it like, at a certain level immoral because you're not taking the highest priority thing, but on the second level, it's self-defeating. It's not the thing that, the things that you should have learned from last year's election is that you need to be giving real material things to people's lives. If you talk about materialism, that's the thing that, we have on the table. And, there's an important reason why the Democrats in the early 2000s, the things they focused on the most were Bush tax cuts, which of course, were, redistributive upwards and bad and all that, but they also kept effective demand going and, kept people employed. That kind of argument is easy to make, is consistent with, at least a certain faction of capitalist interests because they still control the society. It's just their taxes are a little higher, and doesn't fundamentally change anything, and fundamentally also doesn't improve people's lives. That's the flip side. Is how terrible the Bush tax cuts didn't win them any damn elections. It didn't help at all. So there's a reason this stuff falls apart. And as much as we want people to, as leftists, metaphysically connected to the idea, well, the rich are doing worse because we raised their marginal tax rates, 12% or whatever. People they're still living their lives. Their lives are what matters. High taxes on the rich or not. If their lives don't change, that. What's the point? And no matter how high you raise their marginal tax rate, capitalists are still going to control the means of production. And, that means controlling people's working lives. If your boss is still shitty, if your boss is still, is still sexually harassing you and, giving you crappy hours, but, his tax rate is, 10% higher or 20% higher, whatever, what does that matter to me? He's still harassing me. So you have to give people material things. You have to give them a public option in jobs, a basic level of working conditions that compete with that private option. You need to be able to give them health care so they're less tied and less desperate in essential part. And I may support, raising taxes on the rich, or even, if we want to get more polemical, expropriating the wealthy or whatever crap like that. But that's not the essential thing that people care about. And frankly, also, if you read Marx, I'd be surprised that's the essential things that you care about. If you read Volume 1, his horrific discussions of, people suffocating in factories because there's literally not enough air given the amount of people that they shove in there, it's not like Marx finishes those paragraphs and goes, oh, and we need to raise the tax rate on, the top 1% to, 8.5%. No, he's talking about working conditions, and, no matter how, it's sort of weird where you get the sort of posture of radicalism and then, at the end, tax the rich to fund these social programs. So that's not the essential point.
So I want to touch one thing because we're running out of time here. When I look at the idea of income and wealth inequality, because, obviously these terms are bandied around a lot, sometimes appropriately, sometimes very inappropriately. But I want to just state for the record that when you provide people medical health coverage, and not just insurance, but medical health care as a right, you immediately eliminate the capital flight from their wallet, if you will, or whatever you want to say. You immediately change income inequality right there, immediately. And then when you look at a federal job guarantee, you immediately change income and wealth inequality instantly. And then when you look at things like providing student debt relief, immediately you change income inequality because so much of this inequality comes from private debt-driven economic policies. And that entire neoliberal monetarist nonsense has really caused a chasm of understanding in our movement. People just assume it's this, they have this boogeyman that doesn't exist. It's our government policies. And if we want to have better, our Congress has to do better. But the reality is, if you want to solve for income inequality, it's less the taxation and far more, in my opinion, on providing the goods and services needed by the regular man and woman and providing them with living wages and living benefits. And then they don't have to go into private debt to sustain their basic living. And that right there would eradicate huge amount of upward drift of capital, if you are, of money or whatever, of wealth in general. I mean, can you talk a little bit about paying on them to address income inequality versus taxing from them to, lowering the top versus raising the bottom?
Well, I think the first thing to say there and really hammer home that point is that the fundamental meaning of inequality is different. When the difference between inequality, when the difference between having wealth and having income and not having wealth and not having income, when that difference is your family starves, when that difference is that you don't have you or your children don't have a place to sleep that night, when that means that your kid died of cancer because you didn't have the wealth to pay for your kid's medical care, that the fundamental meaning of inequality is different with these different types of social programs. That doesn't mean inequality doesn't matter. But if you talk to someone, and you talk to someone in America today, them not having wealth means very potentially that their kid dies, or they die, or their spouse dies. That it means that they're not able to, go to school and and have a better life. It means that their kid sleeps on the street. I mean, that's fundamentally what it means. If you're in a society where, there's housing security, defended by public right, where you have a right to a job. Shout out to Raul Carrillo's article, the government owes you a job. When you have these things as fundamental rights, then the difference between having wealth and not having wealth still matters, but it's not the same thing. It's not necessarily a matter of life and death. And I think that's the crucial point. You fundamentally qualitatively change the character of inequality. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry about inequality even if we get all these things. Inequality still matters, and to the extent that inequality in control and wealth and control over the means of production, and inequality in wealth, inequality in income, to the extent that those drive political differences and can potentially push back against the gains we've made, it's important to be able to hit that conflict head on. But they're not fundamentally of the same character, and that fundamentally, it's control over our lives and want that, and the level of want that we have for our basic needs and desires. That's fundamentally why inequality is bad. Absolutely. And that when you don't have the focus on that, what's the point? If you can give people some sort of control over their lives, if they have more control about what goes on in their workplace, if they have access to what they need in their lives, to housing, to healthcare, to food, then inequality starts losing importance. Fundamentally, when you get to the end point, when money can't buy control over someone else's life, which is fundamentally what the radical aim, the radical goal is, then inequality of money isn't that different. If all I can buy with money is just some extra goods and services and not more of the basic necessities of life, or not of the standard version of it, it starts to really lose its importance. I mean, the guy I mentioned, J.W. Mason, Josh Mason from John Jay School of Criminal Justice, he mentions that the ultimate goal as a leftist should be getting to the point where quantitative comparisons of different people's lives isn't possible and doesn't matter, because people have access to what they need and money can't buy control.
I want to say something real quickly. This is super important to me. I talked to Scott Ferguson earlier today, mm-hmm. and one of the things that came out of this, and I think if he's still watching, I hope he gets this shout out. But Dr. Scott and I spoke at length about the idea of the UBI only crowd coming in and talking about robots and stuff like that. This is a problem that is very, very passionate to me, and it makes me almost freaking bust into tears over it because I get so angry and enraged. My father died of something called supranuclear palsy, progressive supranuclear palsy. It is something that very few people in the world have. It is very, very minuscule amount of people that actually have progressive supranuclear palsy, which is a destroying of a human being's brain. And all of a sudden you watch them little by little die as parts of their brain shut off, and you see them no longer be able to swallow. And all of a sudden another part happens, they stop being able to breathe, or they stop being able to do other normal things, and all kinds of horrible things happen to them. It is such a small amount of people that it will never be profitable for it to ever have research done on it, for it to ever have medication and treatments or a cure on it. Now, my father passed away in September. And these robot fetishizers, these automation fetishizers that think the UBI only is the way to go, they don't realize how much work is left undone because it's not profitable. It's not profitable to the capitalists they claim to hate. But here we are. We can redefine work. We can redefine a job. We can redefine the way society looks. But they will still talk about these goddamn robots and automation. And we could have solved my father's illness had we invested in tons of jobs, digging into these minor things. So many of these illnesses exist. So many of them. And yet, we don't bother actually digging in and realizing how much work is left undone. It's infuriating. It's beyond infuriating.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is one of the craziest things when you get asked, like, well, what jobs would people do? It's like, have you look around in your community, just even basic things. I mean, that is a tremendous and horrible story, and something that, absolutely would be something that I'd, want a job guarantee to devote it to. But even basic things, just like, the quality of, the New York City subway, the quality of, just, basic communities and what resources you have available in your local community. There's so many basic things that you walk around. It's like, well, why isn't someone doing that? Or couldn't someone do that? And you go, yes, someone could. There are all sorts of things that you can make a city better, a suburban area better, a rural area better. Just, basic things that improve quality of life that, that could be done. And absolutely, I think that is, an essential point. And of course, the ironic thing about the robot thing is that, all this is happening during a time of a true drop-off in productivity over the last decade. That, there's a strong argument to be made is because, there hasn't been enough government spending, and maybe even that wages have been too low. To give a shout out, maybe we're going to talk about it sometime. Josh Mason that I mentioned before, has a report coming out next month on all this stuff, making, what I think is a very convincing argument that it's, the stagnant economy itself and our the lack of public spending, which is the ultimate source we're looking for, that's been keeping productivity from going up. And you're never going to, have, your productivity revolution, robots or not, if we don't get, some spending going. And that spending should be for public purpose and should be about making our lives better and dealing with climate change. And that we can't there's no robot, there's no, magic fix of the market, whether it's, marketers saying that if you leave free marketers saying that you leave everything to the free market, things will supposedly get fixed, or the techno free marketers who say that, if you leave everything to the free market, they'll fix everything with robots. It's just not going to happen. And there's so many practical things that need to be done that aren't going to be done by robots. And no, nurses aren't about to replace robots. There isn't going to be this huge army of robots that are going to provide the technical and effective care that nurses provide. And we need a whole lot of more of nurses.
Absolutely. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to close on this, and I'll let you have the last word. But, as I look around my life and I look around my kids' lives and I look around the things that, I took for granted growing up, like music class every day, choir every day, gymnastics or physical education every day. Watching kids be able to just say, yeah, I want to play football, and they get to go play football every day. And, they got to play baseball. They got to play whatever sport was there for the school. They got to play it. Now these kids can't do that because the schools are starving. The state of Pennsylvania is drowning in over $600 million deficit right now. Friggin' $600 million shortfall. And that's just the state of Pennsylvania. You look around the other states in the nation, and many of them are absolutely floundering because of a lack of federal spending right now. And so when we talk about jobs not being there, I assure you, everywhere I look, there is work that isn't being done because the man can't profit off of it. And so since the man can't profit off it, and these robot lovers are not realizing how many jobs are undone because the man can't profit on it, and they claim to be revolutionaries, but yet they parrot the man's comments instead of realizing that we can in fact fund those kind of jobs so we can make our world better, so we can improve our communities. So these even should appeal to the Tea Party and folks like that who want to locally administer things. This is an opportunity to allow them local control so that they can influence what they feel is important in their own communities. It infuriates me that people don't look at it this way. I mean, infuriates me.
Yeah, I know. it's such a lack of vision, of not being able to see, how things could be improved. And of course there is, a concern that you have to be careful about administer, some the theoretical, hypothetical public administrator who tries to use, job guarantee workers as scabs, and you would want to set up some sort of program that, if some local public school teachers on strike, that, administrators couldn't bring in a bunch of job guarantee workers to replace them. And this is certainly an important political point that maybe we can talk about another time. But,
Absolutely.
in the normal, way things are, there's no contradiction between, having, a well-stocked army of teachers and having some person who, has some specialty and has some free time, or otherwise, isn't finding private employment, come in and teach something about their specialty. And, teach a class on, say, you're really into the ancient Near East. I've sort of got interested in it in the last couple of years, and to have a special class or AP class or whatever it is to teach students on that topic, which, is perfectly fine that your local public school teacher isn't, an expert in, ancient Near East history, co-teaching a class. I have a personal experience with teaching a class and having two teachers in that room, and being able to, and it gives you just so much more flexibility to be able to have that. Not to say that you can't run the classroom without it, but, an extra teacher is always helpful, and you can always add something. And the point, it adds something to the quality of that education. I mean, there is something additive that and isn't combative, especially if you structure it right for, even basic things and of course, like you said, also after school programs is an essential thing, to create after school programs that you could pay vacancies with, job guarantee jobs. I mean, the only limit is your imagination. And a lot of people, seem to, be stuck in, as they say, neoliberalism, and have their imagination really, strangled by what seems possible now. And it may be true that we'll lose that political fight over it, but a lot of people in the past have gotten awfully close over this sort of thing. And, if we don't get everyone on the same base in terms of how things work, and, making consistent arguments, and we don't try, then we'll never get anything. Conceding before you even try, doesn't, you lose either way. Fighting and losing is much different from, assuming you're going to lose and then losing.
Right. So we are literally out of time, Nathan. It blows my mind how quickly these hours go.
Of course.
But coming up in literally 2 minutes, folks, we have our very first episode of a new show we're doing called Vegan Planet with Trisha Roberts and Keith Bergen. It's a very exciting group. They are ethical vegans, and they are abolitionists. So I recommend very, very, very strongly tuning in. They are two experts. And if you watched a few weeks ago, we did a show called Going Vegan, where they were trying to educate me, and I will be honest with you, my progress is slow, but we're working on it. We are indeed working on it. So without further ado, I'm going to say thank you once again, Nathan, for joining us. I really, really appreciate our time together. I appreciate our friendship very much. And I'm going to let you go. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you later. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. See you.